Welcome back. Last time we looked at the material in chapter 1 of the Gospel of John following the prologue. This material was devoted primarily to the witness of John the Baptist and the call of the first disciples by Jesus. The material was structured into 4 days through the use of a recurring phrase, "on the next day." John the Baptist's witness we divided into 2 major parts: John's witness concerning himself and John's witness concerning Jesus. Then John points 2 of his disciples in the way of Jesus, and they become Jesus' disciples. This leads one of them, Andrew, to find his brother Simon Peter, who also becomes a disciple. Jesus then finds Philip and invites him to discipleship. And Philip in turn finds Nathanael, who after some cajoling becomes a disciple also. In our current session, we complete the first week of the new creation in Christ, with the sign of Jesus changing water into wine at Cana in Galilee. This will formally introduce the theme of completion, which we saw in the prologue. The water of the Jewish purification rites will be brought to completion in the wine of the kingdom. Then the locale changes to Jerusalem, and we will give a little background on the geography of Jerusalem. This will be followed by a narration of how Jesus shows that the locus of the presence of God in the temple has now been brought to completion in himself, the Word made flesh, who reveals the glory of the Father. This is known in many cases as the cleansing of the temple, but as we shall see, it's a lot more than that. The locale now changes to Cana, a small village of Galilee not far from Nazareth, approximately 8 miles northeast of Nazareth. Here we have a panoramic picture of Cana as it exists today. You can see that it's grown from the small village that it was in the first century. Moving in closer, we have a picture of one of the streets outside of the church commemorating the miracle of Jesus. And finally, we have a picture showing the Greek Orthodox Church, the one with the red roofs, and the Latin Rite Church from a field opposite both. The author of the Gospel of John chooses Cana as the site of the first of 2 of Jesus' signs narrated in the Gospel. These 2 narratives frame the 2nd through 4th chapters of John's Gospel. And within that frame, we have the temple incident, or Jesus and the Jews, Jesus' first encounter with the Jews, followed by a comment on faith. Then Jesus encounters Nicodemus, the ruler of the Jews, and enters into dialogue with him. Following the Nicodemus episode, Jesus speaks of John the Baptist, and this leads into the dialogue with the woman from Samaria at Jacob's well in Sychar, ending with the meeting of Jesus and the villagers of Samaria. Now let's take a closer look at that first sign. The 2nd chapter of John's Gospel opens with a crisis at a wedding in the village of Cana. Jesus is drawn into the crisis by his mother, who knows that her son can resolve the situation, saving much embarrassment and loss of honor. The narrative begins simply with the phrase, temporally, on the 3rd day. This phrase, as we noted last time, connected the Cana narrative to the narratives of chapter 1 to create the first week of Jesus' public ministry. Although, also, through the allusion to Genesis 1:1 in John 1:1, it's a narrative of the first week of the new creation with Jesus, the new Adam. What happens on this 3rd day is a wedding in Cana, which is described as Cana in Galilee to distinguish it from Cana, located in the Phoenician city of Tyre, mentioned in Joshua 19:28. Then a notation with regards to some of the participants is given. Specifically, we're told that the mother of Jesus was there. Note that she is not named. That's true of the entire of the Gospel of John. Jesus' mother is never named, only referred to as the mother of Jesus. Then it simply states that she was there. This phraseology seems to imply that Jesus' mother was more than a guest. She seemingly was involved in the hosting of the wedding. Thus, the couple being married may have been close relatives of the family. This would also explain the role that the mother assumes later on in the narrative. Then, using the adversative de, Jesus and his disciples are introduced. They are not merely there, they're invited to the wedding. Thus, there is a clear distinction made between Jesus' mother's presence and the presence of Jesus and his disciples. Here is a map of northern Israel, in particular the region of Galilee. As you can see, Nazareth is located toward the south of Galilee, and Cana is directly north of Nazareth, with the great Roman city of Sepphoris in between. Following the scale, the distance from Nazareth to Cana would be approximately 6 to 8 miles. We now move to the main site at Cana, the church commemorating the changing of water into wine. Here is a picture of the facade of the church. There is a convent connected to the church and a house for the priests who serve the parish. It's still a viable operating parish in Cana. Inside, we have the sanctuary of the upper church, which is decorated with stone water jars. Above the tabernacle, we see a painting depicting the miracle. In the lower, or the crypt church, there is yet another sanctuary with even large water jars in the rear. Above the presider's chair is a painting of the miracle. Upon entering the church, one certainly knows which miracle is being commemorated here. With verse 3, we come to realize that the main thrust of this narrative is not marriage. Rather, it's the embarrassing situation of wine running out during the wedding banquet. The problem is brought to Jesus' attention by his mother, who quietly tells him they have no wine. Now, as I mentioned above, this would be a rather unusual request on Jesus' mother's part, unless she was closely involved with the hosting of the wedding celebration, in which case this situation would cause grave embarrassment to her as part of the family hosting the wedding. Jesus' response is rather unusual also. He uses an idiom. Literally, he says to his mother, "What is to you and to me, woman?" Now, there are two things that must be explained in the context of this response. The idiom, "What is to you and to me?" literally asks, what's in common between your concern and me? So, freely it could be translated, how does your concern involve me? Or, what do you want me to do about that? The second part is more critical. Jesus addresses his mother by the term woman. Now, any son today of any age addressing his mother with the term woman is looking for a good swift slap across the face. Not so in the first century. That address was common when addressing a woman. Jesus uses it in this gospel twice for his mother, once for the Samaritan woman, once for Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John alone. Several commentators say that despite its brusqueness in English, it does express affection in the original society. Now, John continues, "My hour has not yet come." The expression hour in the Gospel of John is referent to Jesus being lifted up, more precisely, his being lifted up on the cross. That will make clear the meaning of all 7 of the signs that come forward in the Gospel, as all of them point to that sign, the cross. So it's not time for Jesus to act, as that crucial hour has not yet arrived. But Jesus' mother will not be put off by her son's seeming refusal to resolve this problem. She goes immediately to the servants and tells them to do whatever he asks. Some see the command as reminiscent of the famine in Egypt, where Pharaoh tells the Egyptians to go to Joseph and do whatever he tells them in Genesis 41:55. The command is further evidence that Jesus' mother is more than just a guest at this wedding. She can order the servants, and they will listen. In addition, she knows that Jesus will do something, since she has asked him to. He will not refuse his mother. Then, the author inserts a short aside concerning water jars. He notes, "Now 6 stone water jars were lying there according to the purification rites of the Jews, each holding 2 to 3 measures. This prepares the way for the command that Jesus will give to the servants. The jars are stone because stone did not contract any uncleanness. Hence, the water for purification would remain pure. The size of the jars is given as 2 or 3 measures each. A measure in those days was equivalent to approximately 10 gallons. Thus, each jar held 20 to 30 gallons of water. So in all 6 would hold 120 to 180 gallons of water." In the course of excavation around the church in Cana, a series of stone jars was found in the lower area of the church. Some consider these to be similar to the jars mentioned in John's Gospel. One such stone jar is pictured here. One would not be carrying this jar too far at all. This picture shows another type of jar which might possibly be carried. But for the narrative of John, the jars could very well have been stationary, with no need to be carried from point to point. True to form, as his mother knew he would be, Jesus commands the servants to fill the jars with water. They comply, filling them, the 6 jars, to the top, heos ano, as the Greek puts it, literally up to the up, or as we would say, to the brim. This fact is mentioned to show that there will be no possibility of adding anything to the water. What's in the jars is water and only water. Then Jesus gives a second command: "Draw now, and take to the head waiter." The servants must have considered this rather unusual. Why would they take water to the head waiter? But nevertheless, they did it. And it is the fulfillment of these 2 commands that causes the miracle to take place. Jesus really does nothing. Between the pouring in of the water and the drawing out of the water, the miracle occurs. Further, the term architriklinos, which is generally translated as head waiter. A triclinium was a triple couch used by guests at a banquet to recline. These couches were arranged in a U shape with one side open for the servants to approach the guests. Archi refers to prime or first, hence he who is the head of or master of the banquet. It could be a paid position, or it could be assumed by one of the guests. Sirach gives direction to the one chosen for such a position. In 31:1-2, he says, "If they make you master of the feast, do not exalt yourself. Be among them as one of their number. Take care of them first, and then sit down. So then, the head waiter tasted the water now become wine. Note, the Greek perfect implies that the wine is a present result of a past action, the past action of the waiter's obeying Jesus' commands. He did not know where it had come from. However, note the servants knew, since they were the ones who drew the water. And so, he summons the bridegroom to see if he can shed light on where this wine came from. Note, only Jesus, presumably his mother, and the servants know exactly what has happened. Quite amazed at what he has just tasted, the architriklinos says to the bridegroom, "Every man serves first the good wine, the kalos oinos." That adjective good implies a good quality of wine. Then, when the guests have drunk freely, literally become a little tipsy, signified by the Greek verb methusko, he serves a lesser vintage. However, you have reserved the good wine until now. Note the double use of good wine. So the water of the Jewish ritual purifications has become in Christ the good wine of the kingdom. The completion theme appears here in the narrative of John. So, with wine being a sign of joy and happiness, the ritual washing of the law, purification, gives way to the joy and happiness of the kingdom. Old grace making way for the new, as we saw in the prologue. The narrative ends with a further editorial comment. It introduces the Johannine theme of signs. Jesus made this the first of his signs in Cana, and it manifested his glory. That is, this sign was a revelation of the presence of God among God's people through the actions of Jesus. These signs are meant to bring people to belief, which the disciples do. His disciples believed in him, John says. Throughout the first part of the gospel, chapters 2 through 11, there will be 7 miracles, which Jesus will do, and John will single out as signs. All of them, in some way or other, point to the great sign of the gospel, the cross and the resurrection. All, in some way or other, manifest the presence of God, the glory of God. The narrative of the first sign in Cana is followed by a transitional statement from Cana to Capernaum. After this, he went down from the hill country around Cana to Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. The verb katabaino in Greek implies a descent, baino, to go, and kata, down. Together they mean to go down or descend. Then the full group who went down is described: Jesus himself and his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. The group then remains in Capernaum for several days. Here is a map of Galilee. The central feature is the Sea of Galilee. At the extreme north of the Sea of Galilee is the town of Capernaum. Moving west from Capernaum and slightly south, we see the village of Cana. Following the scale of miles, the distance between Cana and Capernaum would be approximately 15 miles. This is a map of first century Israel with red borders and with the contemporary borders of the Middle East, the political borders in heavy red superimposed. You can see Cana and Capernaum are both in the region of Galilee, which today is in the modern country of Israel. Hence, the sites today would be under the jurisdiction of the Israeli government. John chooses to move a passage found at the end of the ministry of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So from Capernaum, Jesus travels the 5-day journey south to Jerusalem, where he encounters the buyers and sellers in the temple. Note, in John's Gospel, Jesus travels freely between Galilee and Jerusalem. This is significantly different to the Synoptics, where his ministry there is seemingly one trip to the city of Jerusalem. This narrative begins with a reference to time. The Passover of the Jews was near. This is the first of 3 Passovers narrated in the Gospel of John. The other 2 are found in chapter 6 and chapter 13. We are thus in the spring of the year. Traditionally, Passover was celebrated beginning at sundown on the 15th day of the Jewish month of Nisan. It should be noted that the Jewish day began at sundown and ran until sundown approximately 24 hours later, not from midnight to midnight as our days begin. Passover was one of those major feasts of the Jews, which was celebrated in the context of the family. As Harper's Bible Dictionary puts it, the Passover was a religious festival commemorating God's deliverance of the Jews from bondage. The English term translates the Hebrew word Pesach, as used in Exodus 12:13. I will pass over you, and no plague shall fall upon you to destroy you, when I smite the land of Egypt. This is thus a feast that's connected to the exodus from Egypt, when the Israelite slaves won their freedom from Pharaoh under Moses. As a result of the nearness of the feast, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Here's a map of Israel in Jesus' day. The shortest route from Galilee to Jerusalem would be through the Central Highlands, that is, the region of Samaria as shown by the arrow. However, this route was not the usual route, as it was quite dangerous. Normally, one would travel up the eastern border of Samaria along the east bank of the Jordan River, ultimately passing through the Decapolis and Perea. This would, in essence, avoid travel in Samaria. Jesus chooses the more difficult and dangerous route here. Now let's take a moment to look at a map of the city of Jerusalem. The original city was the southeastern section known as the City of David. This was the area conquered from the Jebusites by David and his troops. From there, the city expanded northward with the Millo at the top of the City of David, being filled in to connect it to the Temple Mount, the area where Solomon built his temple, and the second temple was rebuilt after the exile. From there, the city expanded westward, crossing the Tyropoeon Valley, producing the lower city and the upper city, and to the west, and ultimately the new city to the north. The normal approach to the city was from the east, and it was to climb the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. From the top of the Mount of Olives was a spectacular panoramic view of the city. Then the visitor would descend, crossing the Kidron Valley, and enter the city via the Golden Gate onto the temple complex. The author loses no time in narrating the situation at hand. Jesus finds in the temple complex those who were selling cattle and doves and the money changers sitting at their tables. Notice I said temple complex, while the word on the slide is temple. Now, the animal sellers and the money changers were not inside the actual temple building. They were on the temple complex or the temple compound. That large area designated on the map, which we saw before. In Greek, there are two words used for temple. The first is hieron, which refers to the general area around the temple, what's known as the Temple Mount or the Temple Complex, the platform on which the temple building was situated. The second word that is used is naos, which is the actual temple building, the place where God dwells. The word used in the sentence, as you can see from the slide, is hiero, referring to the mount or the complex. This picture shows the panoramic view of the 21st century Old City of Jerusalem from the top of the Mount of Olives. Two things stand out. First is the golden domed building that dominates the scene. This is the Dome of the Rock, a mosque sacred to Islam as the site from which Muhammad was said to have ascended into heaven. It stands on the site of the Temple of Jerusalem of Jesus' day. The second is the wall which goes across the entire picture. It's the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. Toward the right are two arched gates, known as the Golden Gate, which have been bricked up. This took place in the 8th century, when a Muslim caliph in Jerusalem closed off the entrance to the temple area, denying it to unbelievers. This is a picture of the wall of the Temple Mount on the western side. It's appropriately known as the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, because it's the closest that a devout Jew can get to the temple area today. This picture gives a hint of what the panorama would have been like in Jesus' day. It's a picture of a model of the temple of Jesus' day as it sits on the Herodian Temple Mount, which are part of the model of the city of Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. The model is a model of Jerusalem in Jesus' day, constructed by archaeologists Nachman Avigad and Michael Aharoni in the middle 1960s. We see the temple from yet another angle on the model. This view gives us a better view of the court of the Gentiles, where Jesus taught, and where the buyers and the sellers were located. The colonnade along the back and the sides form the stoa of the Temple Mount, which was one of the places that Jesus preferred to teach. The area where the buyers and the sellers congregated was just outside the main temple building, in a large esplanade designated by the second arrow. Now back to the narrative. Jesus acts, making a whip of cords. Then he drives or casts out all of them from the temple area. By all would be meant those selling the animals along with the animals. Then he moves to the money changers, pouring out their coins and overturning their tables. All in all, he creates quite a commotion and quite a mess in that courtyard outside the temple building. Then the purveyors of smaller animals are thrown out, those selling doves. He says, "Take these from here." All the necessities for offering sacrifice Jesus has eliminated. Thus, he strikes at the very essence of the temple. He then makes a double allusion to Zechariah 14:21 and Jeremiah 7:11. "Do not make the house of my Father a house of trade or a marketplace." The Zechariah allusion explains the marketplace saying, and there no longer shall be a trader in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. And the allusion to Jeremiah explains why. "Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself has seen it, says the Lord." One needs to read the whole of Jeremiah's temple sermon in chapter 7 of the book of Jeremiah, where it's clear that den of thieves refers to those who go out and violate every commandment of the covenant, and then come back and expect to be protected in the confines of the temple. God tells his people through Jeremiah that such actions will lead to the destruction of the temple. Jesus has a similar message here. Now, the disciples who would accompany Jesus are brought into the narrative. They see what's just occurred, and they recall yet another text of the Hebrew Bible, citing Psalm 69:9. Zeal for your house will consume me. The actual text of the psalm is zeal for your house has consumed me, and the insults of those who insult you have fallen upon me. John has just thus changed the tense of the verb from a perfect in the Hebrew Bible to a future in his citation. That gives a veiled reference to the crucifixion. In John, an early indicator of things that will lead to Jesus' death, that is, his being consumed, is this incident. No one can act in the way that Jesus acts in the temple precincts without drawing the eye of the temple authorities. And so the authorities here, known as the Jews, approach Jesus and question his authority to do what he has just done. What sign do you show us that you do these things? Now, sign has just been used to describe Jesus' miraculous act at Cana. But that's not what the Jews want. They want an authentication of Jesus' authority to act in the way he has. Jesus responds with a somewhat enigmatic statement. Destroy this temple, using the word for the building itself, and in 3 days I will raise it up, using the word generally associated with the resurrection. As we shall see, Jesus says one thing, and the Jews hear something quite different. The Jews' response belies their understanding of what Jesus has just said. It took 46 years to build this temple, and in 3 days you will raise it up. The Jews are taking Jesus' statement literally concerning the building that stands in front of them, thus misunderstanding Jesus' point. He's talking about something quite different. As a reader of John's Gospel, we recall from the prologue that when the Word became flesh, the presence of God that was traditionally in the temple now takes up residence, tented in the Word made flesh. That's what explains Jesus' meaning here. So be sure that the reader or the hearer gets that notion, the editor explains that one, i.e. Jesus, was speaking concerning the temple of his body, that is, the flesh, in which the divine word tented. The narrative ends with a reference to that fuller understanding of this incident that the disciples had once the whole experience was understood after the resurrection. When therefore Jesus was raised from the dead, the author uses the usual term egero for resurrection. 2 things happened. First, the disciples remembered that he was saying this. That is the citation in 2:17. And the saying of Jesus on the temple. With that further understanding that they had as a result of experiencing the death and resurrection of Jesus, they then believed, seeing the full meaning of both the scripture and the word that Jesus spoke. Well, This is a good place to stop. The second chapter ends with a comment on faith, which forms a bridge between this narrative and the story of Nicodemus in the third chapter. So we shall look at those sections next session. See you then.